Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. The Quiet Rivalry. Chapter 1. Miss Marple liked to take her tea at precisely 4:30. Not because she was fussy about time. She had lived long enough to know that time, like people, rarely behaved as it should, but because 4:30 was when the light in her sitting room softened. It slipped through the lace curtains without glare, resting gently on the arm of her chair and the little table beside it, as though it had come only to observe and not to intrude. She sat now, with her teacup balanced neatly on its saucer, the thin porcelain warm against her fingers. Outside the open window came the steady, patient sound of gardening, the scrape of a trowel, the soft snip of secateurs, the faint rustle of leaves being gathered. Mary, her maid, was at work in the small front garden. Miss Marple sipped her tea and watched the steam curl upward, dissolving into the afternoon air. She had always thought that tea revealed a great deal about people. Some drank it hurriedly, as if it were merely something to be got through. Others let it grow cold, distracted by their own thoughts. And then there were those who held the cup as though it were an anchor, something solid in a world that changed too quickly. She herself belonged to the last category. Mary paused outside, straightening her back with a small sigh. Miss Marple could see her through the window, hat slightly askew, gloves pushed down over soil-stained fingers, her attention fixed on a stubborn patch of earth near the hedge. "Those roses are determined to survive," Mary said, not loudly, but with the confidence of someone who knew she would be heard. "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "They often are, even when they shouldn't be." Mary glanced up, smiled politely, and returned to her task, clearly unsure whether the remark had been philosophical or merely observational. Miss Marple suspected it was a little of both. St. Mary Mead lay unusually quiet that afternoon. Not empty, never empty, but subdued, as if the village itself were resting. A few distant voices drifted from the lane, and somewhere a dog barked once and then thought better of it. The church bell, which usually rang out with enthusiasm even for the smallest occasions, remained silent. Miss Marple liked days like this. They allowed one to notice things. She noticed, for instance, that Mrs. Alice Hart had not passed the gate on her usual walk. Alice was punctual in her habits, another thing Miss Marple had learned over the years. Every afternoon, unless the weather was truly dreadful, Alice Hart walked slowly along the lane, stopping to speak to whoever happened to be about, her smile ready, her manner warm and unhurried. Today, however, there had been no sign of her. Miss Marple did not frown or remark upon it. She merely placed the observation neatly among others, the way one might tuck away a spare button. Her gaze moved instead to the low table by the window, where a small bunch of lavender lay beside a folded letter. The letter had arrived that morning, its handwriting careful, slightly old-fashioned. It was from Miss Edith Bell. "Dear Miss Marple, I hope you are well. I wondered whether you might care to call one afternoon this week. Alice has not been herself lately, and I find myself a little uneasy. It would be such a comfort to have your opinion." Miss Marple had read the letter twice, not for its content, but for its tone. Miss Bell was a woman of few words and fewer requests. That she should ask for an opinion at all was, in itself, notable. Miss Edith Bell lived alone at the far end of the village, in a narrow house that seemed always slightly shaded, no matter the time of day. She was known in St. Mary Mead as dependable, helpful, and quietly devoted, particularly to Alice Hart, whom she had known for many years. Poor Miss Bell, people often said, such a good woman, always ready to lend a hand. Miss Marple had never disagreed, but she had also never quite agreed in the way people expected. Outside, Mary had begun to hum softly as she worked. Miss Marple listened, her head tilted slightly as though the tune itself were a clue. She had found over the years that people hummed when they were content, or when they were trying very hard to appear so. "Mary," she said gently. "Yes, miss?" "Have you seen Mrs. Hart today?" Mary shook her head. "No, miss. I thought it was odd myself. Miss Bell passed by earlier, though, said she was on her way back from the chemist." "Did she?" Miss Marple said. "Yes, had a little bottle with her, wrapped up carefully." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Mary." The humming did not resume. Miss Marple finished her tea and set the cup down with care. A bottle from the chemist was in itself a harmless thing. St. Mary Mead was full of bottles from the chemist, tonics for the heart, drops for the nerves, mixtures for digestion, sleep, and spirits alike. And yet... She rose slowly and moved to the window, looking out over the garden Mary had so carefully tended. Everything appeared orderly, neat, well kept. Miss Marple had always distrusted things that were too orderly. She thought of Alice Hart with her ready smile and gentle voice. She thought of Edith Bell, whose kindness was spoken of often, but whose inner life no one seemed to consider at all. And she thought, as she so often did, of two girls she had once known, both fond of the same young man, both perfectly polite, neither ever speaking an unkind word. One of them had married him, the other had not. The village, Miss Marple reflected, had a very long memory. It simply preferred to pretend otherwise. She reached for her hat. "Mary," she said calmly, "I think I shall take a little walk." Chapter 2. Miss Marple found Alice Hart seated in the small sitting room at Hart Cottage, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though she had arranged herself for inspection. The room was tidy without being stiff, furnished with comfortable chairs and faded cushions that spoke of long use rather than careful preservation. A fire burned low in the grate, though the day was not particularly cold. Alice rose at once when Miss Marple entered, then checked herself, pressing a hand lightly against the back of the chair. "My dear Jane," she said with a laugh that arrived a fraction too late. "You must forgive me. I seem to have lost the habit of standing properly." "You are looking after yourself, I hope?" Miss Marple replied, taking the offered seat. "Oh yes, quite," Alice said readily. "Edith sees to that. She's very firm with me." From the doorway came Miss Edith Bell, carrying a small tray with 2 cups and a glass bottle. She moved quietly, placing everything with exactness, as though the position of each object mattered. "You shouldn't tire yourself, Alice," she said gently. "You were dizzy only this morning." "Nonsense," Alice replied, though she did not protest when Edith eased her back into the chair. "I merely stood up too quickly." Miss Marple watched the exchange with mild interest. There was nothing hurried or dramatic about it. If anything, the scene was one of habitual care. Edith poured tea for Miss Marple, then lifted the small bottle. "It's time for your tonic," she said. Alice sighed good-naturedly. "If Edith had her way, I should be measured and timed like a railway train." "And you'd be the better for it," Edith replied. The bottle was uncorked. Edith poured a careful measure into a small glass, her hand steady. Miss Marple noticed that she did not glance at the markings as she poured. She did not need to. Alice drank without hesitation, grimacing slightly at the taste. "Still awful," she said. "But it does seem to help." "It should," Edith said. "It was prescribed years ago for George, you remember. The doctor said it was excellent for weakness." "Yes, I remember," Alice said. "George never could abide medicine." Miss Marple lowered her gaze to her teacup. Names had a way of surfacing naturally in conversation when they were no longer dangerous. "And you feel stronger?" she asked. "Oh, on some days," Alice said lightly. "On others, I feel quite foolish. I forget things. I lose track of time." Edith smiled. "You've always been forgetful." Alice laughed, but again there was a pause, so slight it could have passed unnoticed. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose to leave, declining Edith's offer to walk her to the door. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had earlier, the light less forgiving. Later that evening, the news spread quickly but quietly. Alice Hart had died in her chair, as peacefully as one might hope. There had been no cry, no struggle. Edith Bell had found her, head tilted slightly, hands folded as they so often were. The doctor came. He asked routine questions. He nodded. He spoke of the heart, of age, of weakness. No one contradicted him. At the small gathering that followed, neighbours spoke in subdued voices. Edith sat apart, her back straight, her expression composed. When someone pressed her hand, she thanked them politely. "She was my dearest friend," she said. "I don't know what I shall do without her." Miss Marple stood near the window, observing the room as though it were a sampler with one thread out of place. She noticed how often Edith glanced at the clock. Not anxiously, expectantly. Later, when the house had quieted, Edith approached her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Alice was very fond of you." "I was fond of her too," Miss Marple replied. Edith hesitated. "You don't think—" She stopped, then shook her head. "Of course not." Miss Marple met her gaze. "I think only that people do their best, Miss Bell." Edith nodded, as though this confirmed something she had long believed. As Miss Marple walked home under the dim village lamps, she considered the events of the day. Everything had proceeded with remarkable smoothness. Too smooth, perhaps. She recalled the tonic, the unmeasured pour, the phrase "it should help." And she remembered Alice's words. "On some days, I feel quite foolish." Weakness was a curious thing. It could be natural, or it could be encouraged. Miss Marple turned a corner and continued on her way, her thoughts already arranging themselves into a pattern that would, in time, become impossible to ignore. Chapter 3. In St. Mary. Meade's certainty settled more quickly than doubt. By the third day after Alice Hart's death, the village had arranged its feelings neatly and put them away. There were flowers at Hart Cottage, sympathy cards on the hall table, and a general agreement, spoken and unspoken, that Alice's passing had been sad, but not mysterious. Miss Marple heard these conclusions wherever she went. At the butcher's, Mrs. Latham shook her head gravely as she wrapped a joint of beef. Poor Alice, such a gentle soul, but her heart was never strong, was it? At the post office, Mr. Drew remarked that it was a mercy she had not suffered. "Slipped away just like that," he said, snapping his fingers for emphasis. "We should all be so lucky." Even at church on Sunday, the vicar spoke of Alice's peaceful nature and the comfort of knowing she had been spared pain. Miss Marple listened attentively, her expression mild, her thoughts elsewhere. She was quite aware that most people preferred deaths that did not ask questions. After the service, Edith Bell stood near the lich gate, accepting condolences with quiet composure. She wore black, neatly pressed, and spoke little. When she did, it was to thank someone or to reassure them that she was managing very well. "She's remarkable," someone murmured behind Miss Marple. "So calm, so sensible." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Remarkable." That afternoon she called on Edith at Bell House. The narrow hallway smelled faintly of lavender polish, and everything appeared in its proper place. Edith led her into the sitting room where the curtains were half drawn and the chairs positioned with careful symmetry. "I'm glad you came," Edith said. "I find the days rather long." Miss Marple seated herself. "That is often the case after a loss," Edith nodded. "Alice filled the hours, you see. There was always something to do, something she needed. And now?" Edith's lips curved slightly. "Now there is quiet." She poured tea with steady hands, though Miss Marple noticed she poured her own cup only half full. "You were very devoted to Mrs. Hart," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Edith replied at once. "I always have been." The answer came too easily, as though it had been practiced, not rehearsed exactly, but considered. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You knew her for many years." "Most of my life," Edith said. "We grew up together, went to the same school, walked the same lanes." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you lived such different lives." Edith's eyes flickered toward the window. "Yes." The word was neither resentful nor resigned. It was simply a statement. "She had George," Edith went on after a moment. "A good man, kind, reliable." "And you were fond of him as well?" Miss Marple asked, as though the thought had just occurred to her. Edith smiled faintly. Everyone was fond of George. Miss Marple let the remark pass. People often spoke that way when they meant something quite specific. As she rose to leave, her gaze fell upon a small cupboard near the fireplace, its door slightly ajar. Inside were several bottles, neatly arranged. Some were clearly marked, others bore labels so faded that the writing had become a blur. "You keep a good many remedies," Miss Marple observed. Edith closed the cupboard without comment. "One accumulates them over the years." Alice believed in tonics. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "So I understand." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her own sitting room, her knitting idle in her lap. Outside, Mary was finishing the last of the day's tidying, the sound of sweeping drifting in through the open window. "You've been very thoughtful today, miss," Mary remarked. "Have I?" Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes." "You didn't even correct me when I called the hydrangeas by the wrong name." Miss Marple smiled. "I was thinking about Alice Hart." "Such a shame," Mary said. "But I suppose there was nothing to be done." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Wasn't there?" Mary paused. "Well, no, miss. She was ill, wasn't she?" "So everyone says," Miss Marple replied. Later, when Mary had gone to bed, Miss Marple rose and crossed to her bookcase. She took down an old volume, its spine worn with use, and opened it carefully. Inside were notes she had made years ago, observations about people, habits, and the small ways in which lives diverged. She remembered two young women from her own girlhood. Both had loved the same man. One had married him. The other had remained nearby, helpful, indispensable. When the wife fell ill years later, it was the other woman who knew precisely how much medicine to give. Miss Marple closed the book. The next morning, she called upon Dr. Collins. He greeted her with professional warmth. "I suppose you've come about Alice Hart," he said, very sad. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "May I ask what tonic she was taking?" Dr. Collins looked surprised. "Why, an old mixture. Nothing unusual, strengthening, harmless." "Harmless in what quantity?" Miss Marple asked. He frowned slightly. "Well, like all such things, one must be sensible." "And the dosage?" she persisted. "I assumed Miss Bell followed the instructions," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Of course." As she left the surgery, the pattern in her mind became clearer, not sharp, not accusatory, but unmistakable. Alice Hart had not been poisoned in any dramatic sense. She had been guided gently toward weakness. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Hart Cottage. The house felt altered without Alice's presence. Quieter, less forgiving. In the sitting room, she noticed the chair where Alice had died. It had been moved slightly, angled away from the window. On the small table beside it stood a glass, recently washed. Miss Marple picked it up and held it to the light. The faintest residue clung to the rim, barely perceptible. She set it down again, her expression unchanged. The village would not question Alice Hart's death. There was no reason to. No scandal, no inheritance dispute, no raised voices or suspicious strangers, only a woman who had trusted another woman completely. Miss Marple stepped outside and closed the door behind her. She had not yet decided what she would do. That would come later. Chapter 4. The inquest into Alice Hart's death was a brief and courteous affair, conducted with the sort of efficiency that suggested no one expected surprises. Miss Marple attended, seated near the back, her gloved hands folded neatly, her expression one of mild attention. The coroner spoke of age, of a weakened heart, of peaceful passing. Dr. Collins confirmed his earlier opinion. Miss Edith Bell answered the few questions put to her with quiet clarity. There was no hesitation in her voice, no confusion. The verdict, death by natural causes, was received with gentle nods. People were relieved. St. Mary Mead disliked uncertainty, and this allowed everyone to return to familiar patterns without discomfort. Miss Marple, however, noticed what relief often concealed. Afterwards, outside the small hall, villagers gathered in subdued clusters. Conversation turned quickly to practical matters, the sorting of Alice's belongings, the future of Hart Cottage, whether Miss Bell would remain in the village now that her closest tie had been severed. "She'll be dreadfully lonely," Mrs. Latham said. "Such a devoted friend." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Devotion does have its own difficulties." Mrs. Latham smiled vaguely, missing the point entirely. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Edith Bell herself. She arrived punctually, hat and coat immaculate, her manner composed but strained by a certain stiffness that suggested effort rather than habit. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Edith said. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, indicating a chair. "Please sit down." Edith did so, smoothing her gloves before placing them carefully in her handbag. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to begin. "I wanted to thank you," she said at last, "for your kindness. You were always so considerate of Alice." Miss Marple inclined her head. She was easy to be fond of. "Yes," Edith said, "everyone was fond of her." The emphasis was faint, but it was there. Edith drew a breath. "I shall be moving out of Bell House soon. It feels unnecessary now, living there alone." "I thought perhaps you might advise me." Miss Marple looked at her attentively. "Advise you in what way?" "Well," Edith said, "how one goes on." Miss Marple considered her for a moment. "One usually does," she said, "though not always in the way one expects." Edith's lips tightened slightly. "I sometimes think people believe grief must be visible to be real." "That is a common misunderstanding," Miss Marple replied. "Some people grieve loudly, others very quietly." Edith nodded as though reassured. "Yes, quietly." There was a pause. Outside, the sound of Mary's gardening drifted in through the window. Edith's gaze followed the movement, her eyes lingering a little too long. "You live a very orderly life, Miss Marple," she said suddenly. Miss Marple smiled. "I find it saves time." Edith hesitated, then said, "Alice admired that about you." "Did she?" "Yes, she said you always seemed content." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. Contentment is often mistaken for simplicity. Edith looked at her sharply, then away. "I should go," she said, rising. Thank you for listening." After she had left, Miss Marple sat very still. She replayed the conversation carefully, not for what had been said, but for what had been avoided. Edith had spoken of Alice, of loneliness, of the future, but not once of guilt, doubt, or uncertainty. There had been no if only, no perhaps I should have. Only completion. That evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to Hart Cottage, this time at Mrs. Latham's invitation. The house was in the process of being sorted, its contents arranged into neat piles that suggested decisions already made. "Edith's been so efficient," Mrs. Latham remarked, gesturing toward a stack of papers. "She knows where everything is." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "she would." They paused near the small cupboard by the fireplace, the one Miss Marple had noticed earlier. Its contents had been partially cleared. Several bottles were gone. "Those old medicines," Mrs. Latham said. "Edith said they were no good anymore. Took them away to dispose of properly." Miss Marple nodded. "Very sensible." Later, alone in the sitting room, she examined the surface of the small table beside Alice's chair. A faint ring marked the place where the tonic glass had rested day after day. Miss Marple touched it lightly with her fingertip. Repetition, she reflected, was a powerful thing. It dulled attention. It made routine indistinguishable from necessity. As she left the cottage, she encountered Dr. Collins in the lane. "Miss Marple," he said, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I wanted to say there's really no cause for concern. Alice's heart was quite fragile." "I'm sure," Miss Marple replied. He hesitated. "You do understand that, don't you?" "Oh, yes," she said gently. "I understand perfectly." That night, Miss Marple slept badly. Not from anxiety, but from the peculiar discomfort that came when one saw truth too clearly and had not yet decided how to present it. In the early hours, she rose and made herself a cup of tea. As she did so, she recalled something Edith Bell had said years ago, in passing, at a village fete. "Some people are born lucky," Edith had remarked then, her tone pleasant enough. "Others must learn to be useful." At the time, Miss Marple had thought it merely a comment on circumstance. Now, it revealed itself as something far more enduring. The following morning, Miss Marple sent a note to Edith Bell, inviting her to tea. The wording was polite, casual, almost trivial, but as she sealed the envelope, Miss Marple knew that the quiet rivalry, so long maintained, was nearing its final, inevitable conversation. Not an accusation, not yet. Merely an understanding placed carefully between two women who had spent a lifetime pretending not to share one. Chapter 5. Edith Bell arrived for tea precisely on time. She was dressed in grey, neither morning black nor anything that might suggest cheerfulness, and she carried herself with the same careful composure Miss Marple had observed all her life. If there was tension in her, it was well controlled. Miss Marple welcomed her warmly and poured the tea herself. "I thought it might be pleasant," she said, "to do something ordinary." "Yes," Edith replied. "Ordinary things are comforting." They sat opposite one another, the small table between them neatly arranged. For a few moments they spoke of trivialities, the weather, the state of the roses, the vicar's sermon the previous Sunday. Edith drank her tea slowly as though measuring each sip. "You are settling matters at Hart Cottage, I hear," Miss Marple said at last. Edith nodded. It seemed best. Alice would have wanted everything tidy. "Of course," Miss Marple said. "She was fond of order." "Yes," Edith agreed. She liked knowing where things belonged. The words lingered. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch. "You've been very capable," she said. "The village has noticed." Edith smiled faintly. I've had practice. Have you? Yes, looking after Alice, looking after George before that. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her steadily. That must have required patience. It did, Edith said, but patience can be learned. Miss Marple nodded. I've often thought that patience is one of the most dangerous virtues. Edith's hand paused on her cup. Dangerous? Only when it is misunderstood, Miss Marple replied. People assume it means acceptance. Edith set the cup down carefully. Doesn't it? Not always, Miss Marple said gently. Sometimes it means waiting. Edith looked away toward the window. Outside, Mary was pruning the hedge, her movements methodical and unhurried. You were very close to Alice, Miss Marple continued. Closer than most people realized. She needed me, Edith said simply. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. She trusted you. The words settled between them, heavier than the rest. Edith drew a breath. You sound as though you disapprove. No, Miss Marple said at once. I sound as though I understand. Edith's gaze returned to her, sharp now. Do you? I think so, Miss Marple said. I have known many women who lived near happiness without ever touching it. For a moment, Edith's composure wavered. It was only a flicker, a tightening of the mouth, a slight lift of the chin, but Miss Marple saw it clearly. You're very perceptive, Edith said quietly. One learns, Miss Marple replied, particularly when one pays attention to small things. Edith hesitated. Such as? Such as how much medicine is poured when no one is watching, Miss Marple said calmly. Or how weakness arrives gradually, so gently that it seems almost natural. Edith did not speak. I don't believe you wished Alice harm, Miss Marple went on. Not in the way people imagine harm. You believed you were restoring balance. Edith's fingers curled around her handbag. You don't know that. Miss Marple smiled sadly. I know more than the village does, and more than the doctor chose to ask. Silence fell again, thicker now. I expect, Miss Marple continued, that you told yourself you were only helping her rest, helping her slow down, helping her rely on you. Edith stood abruptly. I think I should go. Miss Marple did not stop her. Of course. Edith paused at the door. You have no proof. No, Miss Marple agreed. I rarely do. Edith turned back, her expression unreadable. Then why say anything at all? Miss Marple met her gaze. Because quiet rivalries deserve quiet endings. Edith left without another word. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone, her tea untouched. She knew she had gone as far as she could without crossing a line she did not yet wish to cross. Edith Bell was not a woman who would break under pressure. She would only speak when speaking served a purpose. The following day, the village received a small surprise. Edith Bell announced she would not be leaving St. Mary Mead after all. Instead, she would take on a more active role in village affairs, organising the church charity fund, assisting the vicar's wife, offering her time wherever it was needed. She's remarkable, people said again. Such strength. Miss Marple heard these remarks with quiet interest. Strength, she reflected, often arrived after something had been settled. That afternoon she received a note from Edith. Dear Miss Marple, perhaps we might speak again. There are things one cannot carry forever. Miss Marple folded the note and placed it carefully beside her teacup. Yes, she thought, that moment had come. Chapter 6. In the days following Edith Bell's visit, Miss Marple did very little that appeared purposeful. She attended the church sewing circle, listened to the vicar's wife describe a minor disagreement over hymn selections, and spent an afternoon helping Mrs. Drew sort through old magazines destined for the jumble sale. It was precisely the sort of behaviour that encouraged people to speak freely. At the sewing circle, Mrs. Latham leaned closer than necessary and lowered her voice. "I've been meaning to ask you something, Miss Marple. You're very observant." "So people tell me," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "It's about Dr. Collins," Mrs. Latham continued. "He's been dreadfully touchy since the inquest." "Has he?" Miss Marple said. "Well, Mrs. Finch said he snapped at her when she asked about Alice's heart. Quite sharp about it, apparently." Miss Marple threaded her needle with care. "Doctors are often sensitive about their judgments." "Yes, but—" Mrs. Latham hesitated. "He did treat Alice for years, didn't he? Prescribed all sorts of things." "Quite a lot of people did," Miss Marple said mildly. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a longer walk than usual, her route passing the doctor's surgery. The windows were open and voices drifted out. Dr. Collins and a woman Miss Marple recognized as Mrs. Finch, who had been Alice Hart's distant cousin and occasional visitor. "I'm telling you, she was taking too much of it," Mrs. Finch was saying sharply. "I saw the bottles myself." "That's impossible," Dr. Collins replied. "The dosage was perfectly safe." "Safe for whom?" Mrs. Finch retorted. "Alice was frail. Anyone could see that." Miss Marple continued on without pause, but the exchange settled neatly in her mind. That evening, she reviewed what she knew of Mrs. Finch, a brisk woman, practical, not particularly fond of Alice, but attentive to family matters when money or responsibility was involved. Alice's modest estate, Miss Marple recalled, would pass to a small circle of relatives, Mrs. Finch among them. The next morning, Miss Marple called upon her. Mrs. Finch received her with a polite stiffness. "I didn't expect visitors." "No," Miss Marple said. "I find that's often the best time to arrive." They spoke of Alice, of course. Mrs. Finch described her cousin as sweet but careless, particularly where her own health was concerned. "She never followed instructions properly," Mrs. Finch said. "Always thought she knew better." "And the tonic?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Finch shrugged. "I warned her about it, told her she didn't need half the things she was taking." "Did you?" Miss Marple said. "Yes. I even poured it out once when I thought she'd taken too much." Miss Marple looked at her sharply. "You poured it out?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Finch said readily. "Alice wasn't watching. She wouldn't have noticed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. As she walked home, the village seemed suddenly full of hands that might have touched the bottle, adjusted the glass, or interfered with routine under the comforting banner of concern. That evening, Miss Marple found herself uneasy. She reviewed the facts again, deliberately stripping them of emotional colour. Alice Hart had been frail. She had taken medicine. Several people knew about it. More than one had access. And Edith Bell, quiet, restrained, visibly devoted, had never once raised her voice, never protested, never shown irritation. Miss Marple sat back in her chair and allowed herself a rare moment of doubt. It was possible, she conceded, that she had mistaken patience for calculation. Possible that Edith had been merely what everyone believed her to be. The following day brought another complication. Dr. Collins called upon Miss Marple himself. "I felt I should speak to you," he said stiffly. "There's been some unkind talk." "About yourself?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, about my treatment of Alice." "And what do you wish to say?" Miss Marple asked. "That I did my duty," he replied sharply. "If someone interfered with the dosage, that is hardly my responsibility." "Someone interfered?" Miss Marple echoed. Dr. Collins hesitated. Mrs. Finch admitted she questioned Alice's medicines. "I don't care for that sort of thing." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Nor do I." After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly, unsettled. Mrs. Finch had motive of sorts. She had opportunity. And she had admitted interference. It was all very tidy. Too tidy. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Edith Bell's house. Edith was out, but the door to the small shed at the back stood open. Inside, Miss Marple noticed several empty bottles arranged carefully in a crate, their labels removed. She did not touch them. Instead, she noticed something else. The crate had been moved recently, but not hastily. The ground beneath showed no sign of urgency. Only habit. Miss Marple walked home slowly. The false path lay very close now, tempting in its clarity. Mrs. Finch could be blamed, Dr. Collins could be questioned, the village would accept it eagerly. And yet, as Miss Marple poured herself tea that evening, she recalled Edith's words from Chapter 5. "I've had practice." Practice, Miss Marple reflected, was not acquired in moments of crisis. It was acquired over years. The false suspect explained access. It explained interference. It even explained carelessness. What it did not explain was control. And control, Miss Marple knew, was never accidental. She took a sip of tea and set the cup down, untouched by relief. Because if the wrong person was blamed, the quiet rivalry would remain exactly what it had always been, unseen, unacknowledged, and dangerously intact. Chapter 7. Miss Marple spent the morning doing something she rarely allowed herself to do. She reconsidered. Not hurriedly and not with irritation, but carefully, setting each assumption aside as one might remove ornaments from a mantelpiece in order to see the wall behind them. The false suspect had presented itself so neatly that it was tempting to accept it simply for the comfort it offered. Mrs. Finch was brisk, interfering, and not especially fond of Alice Hart. Dr. Collins was defensive. Between them lay a plausible explanation the village would welcome. And yet Miss Marple could not rid herself of a faint unease that had nothing to do with medicines or bottles or access. It had to do with tone. She thought again of Edith Bell, of her calm, her precision, her careful avoidance of excess. Edith never exaggerated, never guessed, never misremembered, except, perhaps, once. Miss Marple set down her teacup and reached for her hat. She began at Hart Cottage. The house was nearly empty now. Mrs. Latham had taken charge of sorting the last of Alice's things, and the rooms had that hollow quality peculiar to places that had recently ceased to belong to anyone. Miss Marple moved slowly, as though giving the house time to speak. In the sitting room, she stood before the chair where Alice had died. It had been returned to its original position by the window, facing slightly toward the door. Miss Marple studied the arrangement, not with suspicion, but with familiarity. People, she reflected, rarely altered what mattered most to them. She turned to the small writing desk near the wall. In its top drawer lay a stack of old letters tied with ribbon. Miss Marple did not open them. She had already seen enough to know their nature, domestic, affectionate, unremarkable. George Hart had written kindly. Alice had replied warmly. Nothing in them suggested drama or cruelty, only certainty. As Miss Marple closed the drawer, Mrs. Latham entered, carrying a box of china. "I didn't hear you come in," she said. "It still surprises me, the quiet." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Quiet can be misleading." Mrs. Latham set the box down with a sigh. "I was just thinking, Edith will be so lost now. She spent more time here than anyone." "Did she?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Oh yes, every morning without fail, and most afternoons too, until George died. After that it was almost constant." Miss Marple turned. "Until George died?" "Yes. She said Alice needed her less after that, said Alice preferred to manage on her own." Miss Marple smiled politely, but something in her mind had shifted. That was not how Edith Bell had described it. She left the cottage and walked on toward the churchyard. Near the gate, she encountered Edith herself, standing before George Hart's grave. Edith did not startle when she saw her, which Miss Marple found telling. "I wondered if I might find you here," Miss Marple said. Edith inclined her head. "I come often, or I did." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Edith looked down at the stone. "Yes, Alice used to come with me." Miss Marple waited. "She said it was important," Edith went on, "to remember properly." "That sounds like Alice," Miss Marple said. Edith's lips curved slightly. "She was very good at knowing what mattered." They stood in silence for a moment. "You said once," Miss Marple remarked, "that after George died, Alice became more independent." Edith nodded. "She did." "That's interesting," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Latham believes you were here more often than ever." Edith frowned faintly. "She must be mistaken." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though Mrs. Latham is usually quite observant." Edith said nothing. They walked back toward the village together. At the corner near the post office, Miss Marple paused. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Edith replied. "When Alice began to feel unwell, truly unwell, did she ever resist the tonic?" Edith answered at once. "No, she trusted it." Miss Marple nodded. "And she trusted you?" "Yes." "That is what I thought," Miss Marple said quietly. Edith hesitated. "You make it sound as though trust were dangerous." "It can be," Miss Marple replied, "when it removes the need for questions." Edith looked away. "You still think someone harmed her?" Miss Marple considered her. "I think someone believed they were helping." Edith's hands tightened on her handbag. "You are very careful with your words." "I've found that care prevents mistakes," Miss Marple said. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Finch again. This time, she listened more than she spoke. Mrs. Finch repeated her grievances, her suspicions, her irritation with doctors and routines. She contradicted herself twice without noticing. She spoke quickly and with emphasis. When Miss Marple left, she was satisfied. Mrs. Finch interfered impulsively. Edith Bell did nothing impulsively at all. The final piece came to Miss Marple that evening, as such things often did, without ceremony. Mary mentioned it casually while clearing the table. "Funny thing," she said. "Miss Bell came by this afternoon asking after the roses." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She said Alice always preferred the yellow ones, but that's not right, is it? Alice never liked yellow flowers." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Are you quite sure?" "Oh yes, miss. She always said they reminded her of illness." Miss Marple nodded slowly. It was a small thing, a trivial thing, the sort of thing no one would think to correct, except that Edith Bell had never been careless with Alice's preferences. Never. Miss Marple sat very still. Edith had remembered something incorrectly, but not from forgetfulness. She had remembered it from the wrong place, from a time when she had imagined Alice differently, from a life she had observed so closely that it had begun to blur with her own. The false suspect fell away quietly like a garment no longer needed. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and did not drink it at once. She was certain now, not because of medicine, not because of opportunity, but because of intimacy. One could only make that particular mistake if one believed at some level that Alice's life had been meant to be lived through her. She closed her eyes briefly. Chapter 8. Miss Marple invited Edith Bell to tea on a Thursday, choosing the hour with care. 4:30 was late enough to soften resistance and early enough to prevent fatigue from turning honesty into confusion. She set the table by the window, placed the cups evenly, and opened the curtains just enough to let the light in without exposing either of them to it. Edith arrived quietly. She wore a dark coat and no hat. When Miss Marple offered her a chair, she sat at once. They drank their tea in silence for a moment. It was not an awkward silence. It was the sort that suggested both women understood why they were there and had agreed, without saying so, to take their time. "I think," Miss Marple said at last, "that it would be kindest if we spoke plainly." Edith nodded. "Yes, I hoped you would say that." "You were very good to Alice," Miss Marple continued. "Better than most people noticed." Edith's mouth tightened. "I tried." "You tried very hard," Miss Marple said, "and for a very long time." Edith looked down at her cup. "You think I wanted something from her?" "I think you wanted something for her," Miss Marple said gently. "Or rather, something for yourself that could only be taken through her." Edith did not deny it. She stared out at the garden where the roses Mary had tended were beginning to thin for the season. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "people have been very busy these past weeks discussing medicines and bottles and who touched what. That is all quite understandable. It feels safer to blame accidents." Edith's hands were folded neatly in her lap. "And you?" "I was interested in the way you spoke of Alice," Miss Marple said. "Not in what you said, but in how certain you were. Certainty is a dangerous thing when it belongs to someone else's life." Edith closed her eyes. "I never meant to harm her." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I don't believe you did." That was when Edith finally looked at her. "I only wanted her to rest," Edith said. "She was always doing too much, always being admired, even at the end." "You wanted her to need you," Miss Marple said. Edith's voice was very steady. "She always had. I simply adjusted the balance." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Balance is a tempting idea." Edith drew a slow breath. "I told myself it was kindness, that I was protecting her, that if she were weaker, she would be safer, quieter." "And when she became weaker?" Miss Marple asked. "I told myself it was age," Edith said. "The heart, the doctor said as much." "And when she died?" Edith swallowed. "I told myself I had been right all along." The words seemed to settle in the room, as if testing their weight. "You see," Edith said after a moment, "I lived my life beside hers. Every milestone she reached, I marked quietly, for myself. When George chose her, I learned to be useful. When she married him, I learned to be present. When he died, I learned to be necessary." Miss Marple listened without interruption. "I never hated Alice," Edith said. "I loved her, but I loved the life she had more." Miss Marple nodded. "That is often the case." Edith's hands trembled slightly now. "I didn't measure the tonic to kill. I measured it to diminish. I believed, truly believed, that nothing terrible would happen." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Belief does not change consequence." "No," Edith said, "I know that now." There was a pause. "You noticed the flowers?" Edith said suddenly. "The yellow ones?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Alice never liked them." Edith smiled faintly without humour. "I did." Miss Marple did not respond at once. When she did, it was very softly. "That was when I became certain." Edith nodded. "I knew you would be." They sat together, the quiet between them no longer protective, but final. "What will you do?" Edith asked. Miss Marple met her gaze. "What do you think is right?" Edith did not hesitate. "I will go to the police." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I think that would be best." Edith stood. She smoothed her coat, then stopped. "I should like you to understand one thing," she said. "I never wanted to be Alice. I wanted the world to be fair." Miss Marple looked at her sadly. "The world is rarely fair. It is only honest when we are." Edith nodded. "Thank you for seeing me." "For seeing the truth," Miss Marple corrected gently. Edith left without another word. The village reacted as villages always did, with disbelief first, then with certainty rearranged to suit the new facts. People spoke of signs they had missed, of things they now remembered clearly. The doctor shook his head. Mrs. Finch was relieved. Sympathy shifted, then settled. Miss Marple attended Alice Hart's grave alone one afternoon. The stone was simple, the flowers were modest, the place was quiet. She stood for a moment, then turned back toward the village. At home, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window as the light softened, just as it always did. Outside, Mary's gardening tools made their familiar sounds. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected that rivalries did not always shout. The most dangerous ones learned to whisper, to wait, to wear kindness like a habit. And when they ended, they did so quietly. At precisely 4:30.